The night had settled over the forest, dense and silent, cloaking everything around us in an unsettling stillness. I sat by the campfire, watching as the flames flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the trees. Beside me, Matt was setting up the tent with a focus that spoke of ease and routine. We had done this 100 times before. But this forest felt different. It had an old, watchful quality, like something deep within it had witnessed more than it should. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I found myself drawn to that mystery, and a little afraid of it. It had been Matt's idea to come all the way to the Pacific Northwest to this secluded spot in the woods of Washington State. We both wanted to escape from Chicago's noise and chaos, and I'll admit, the idea of camping alone, miles away from anyone, sounded like a perfect adventure. But there was something about this place that felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that sinks into your skin, filling you with a subtle discomfort. The first strange sound was subtle, a faint rustling in the trees just beyond our campsite. I glanced over, expecting to see an animal, maybe a raccoon or an owl, disturbed by our presence. But the noise didn't repeat itself. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, even though the air was unnaturally still. Matt hadn't noticed, and I decided not to mention it, not wanting to ruin the mood. As the night went on, I tried to shake off my unease. We sat by the fire, laughing and talking, recalling memories of other camping trips, but I couldn't ignore the odd sensation gnawing at me. I kept glancing into the darkness, half expecting to see something watching us from the shadows. And then, just as I was starting to relax, we heard it. A soft, clear whistle. It was distinctly human, and it came from somewhere deeper in the forest. I froze, the sound prickling my skin. It wasn't unusual to hear birds or even the occasional animal call, but it was too precise, too deliberate. Matt looked at me, eyebrows raised in confusion, and I could see the same question mirrored in his eyes. Were we alone? Did you hear that? I whispered, barely daring to breathe. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the trees. Probably just another camper messing around, he murmured, but there was no conviction in his voice. There hadn't been any cars or campsites nearby when we arrived. As far as we knew, we were alone. The whistle came again, closer this time, its tone almost playful, like it was taunting us. It sent a chill down my spine. I felt an urge to respond, maybe to call out, but something held me back. Matt seemed to sense my discomfort, taking my hand and giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Let's not freak out," he said, forcing a grin. "It's probably nothing." But it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off, like we were being watched by unseen eyes. We returned to our conversation, but the easy flow of our banter had been interrupted. The warmth of the fire no longer felt comforting, and the once peaceful night now felt stifling, like the forest itself was pressing in on us. And then, the whistle returned, louder, closer, sharper. This time, it was unmistakably near. It sounded as if someone, or something, was right there, hidden just out of sight, watching us. The whistle echoed through the trees, a haunting, almost mocking sound that seemed to twist and warp the night around us. Matt and I locked eyes, and I could see the same uncertainty that I felt flicker across his face. The forest felt darker, the shadows thicker, as though the trees themselves had become sentient, leaning in to observe us. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind or some strange acoustics playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew this was something else. Matt broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should get the fire going stronger," he suggested. I nodded, relieved to have something to do with my hands. We gathered extra branches and fed them into the flames, watching as the fire roared to life, casting a fierce glow across the clearing. But even with the fire blazing, the chill in my bones didn't subside. The whistle sounded again, sharper now, almost urgent. This time, it came from a different direction. I spun around, searching the edge of the clearing, but saw nothing but shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the ground. Matt stood beside me, his face pale in the firelight. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice strained. "There's no one out here but us." He was trying to convince himself, and maybe even me, but I could hear the doubt beneath his words. We were both aware that something was wrong, that whatever was out there wasn't just some harmless prank. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until the whistle came again, so close it felt like it was just a few feet away. I felt an urge to run, to get as far away from that sound as possible, but I forced myself to stay still, my heart pounding against my ribs. I glanced at Matt, and he seemed equally frozen, his eyes darting to the trees as if expecting someone or something to emerge. Then, out of nowhere, we heard footsteps, soft, measured, almost cautious. They crunched lightly on the fallen leaves, approaching from just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. I clutched Matt's arm, my fingers digging into his jacket. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but fear held me rooted in place. "Who's there?" Matt called out, his voice trembling. He tried to sound strong, but I could hear the fear laced beneath his words. There was no response, only the steady, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling us, moving in a slow, predatory rhythm. It was as if we were being stalked, hunted, and the realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. Without warning, the footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. My eyes strained to see beyond the circle of light to catch even the slightest movement in the shadows. But there was nothing, just darkness and the echo of my own heartbeat. I opened my mouth to say something, to suggest we leave, to do anything, when a voice, soft and barely audible, drifted through the night. It was low, almost a whisper, and I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. It sent a wave of dread crashing over me. "We need to go," I finally managed to say, my voice a strangled whisper. Matt nodded, his face ashen. We scrambled to gather our things, fumbling with the tent and throwing our supplies together in a panic. The fire crackled beside us, its warmth a fleeting comfort against the fear that had taken hold. But as we turned to leave, the whistle sounded again, closer than ever, as if it was right behind us. I dared a glance over my shoulder and froze. The sight behind me made my blood turn to ice. Just beyond the firelight, a figure stood, half hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out its face, but it was tall and motionless, watching us with an unnatural stillness. My body went rigid, and for a moment all I could do was stare, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. "Matt," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but he had already seen it too. His grip on my arm tightened, and for a second, I thought he might pull me back towards the fire, as if the flames could somehow protect us from whatever this was. But instead, he took a shaky step backward, pulling me with him as we edged away from the figure. The whistle pierced the air again, echoing through the trees, but this time it wasn't playful or taunting. It was loud, sharp, almost aggressive, reverberating through the clearing like a warning. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as the figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was toying with us, waiting to see what we would do. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran, pulling Matt along as we plunged into the darkness of the forest. The branches clawed at our faces and clothes as we stumbled through the undergrowth, our breaths coming in panicked gasps. I could still hear the whistle, following us, weaving through the trees like it was chasing us, drawing closer with every step. We didn't know where we were going. The path we had used earlier was long lost, swallowed up by the night. All we could do was run, our feet pounding against the forest floor as the whistle grew louder, filling my ears until it was all I could hear. It felt like it was inside my head, a relentless, maddening sound that urged me to keep running, to never look back. But the forest was a labyrinth, and no matter how far we ran, the sound followed us, closing in, relentless. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare stop. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, we stumbled into a small clearing, and there, half hidden in the moonlight, was an old, abandoned ranger station. Without a word, we bolted toward it, crashing through the door and slamming it shut behind us. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, while Matt searched frantically for anything we could use to barricade ourselves in. The station was small, with broken windows and rotting wood, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the darkness outside. For a few seconds, silence fell over us, broken only by our labored breathing. I thought maybe we had lost it. Maybe we were finally safe. But then, from the other side of the door came the whistle, soft, almost gentle, like it was mocking us for thinking we could escape. I felt my stomach drop, and my grip on the door tightened. "We can't stay here," Matt said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I knew he was right, but the thought of going back out there, of facing whatever was out there, made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to cry, but there was no time for that. And then we heard it. The door creaked under a weight pressing against it, slow and deliberate, as if testing our last line of defense. My heart pounded, and I took a step back, realizing with a sickening dread that the door wouldn't hold for long. There was no other way out. We were trapped. Just as the pressure on the door increased, the whistle stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I held my breath, daring to hope it was over. But then, a hand, pale and skeletal, reached through a broken window, grabbing the edge of the wood, and the figure's face appeared in the dim light. I saw only hollow eyes and a twisted grin before I felt Matt's hand on mine, pulling me toward the far end of the room. "Now!" he shouted, and together, we forced open a small, half-rotted back door and dashed into the night, our only thought to keep running, to get as far from that place as possible. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I glanced behind us, half expecting to see it still following, but there was nothing but silence. The whistle had finally stopped. When we finally returned to town, breathless and battered, no one believed our story. But every night since, I hear it sometimes, echoing faintly in the distance, that same haunting whistle. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for us to return, watching, listening, and ready to call us back into the darkness. The old house creaked around me as I leaned against the closet door, holding my breath and listening for footsteps. Summer nights in Vermont always felt different. The air was thick and warm, filled with the sounds of crickets and the occasional owl, but there was something about the house itself that amplified the quiet. It was my grandparents' place, an ancient building with floors that groaned under even the lightest step, and walls that seemed to trap every noise, only to let them echo back to you hours later. This was our second week staying here, and as far as summers went, this one wasn't too bad. My little brother Tommy and my cousin Max were with me, and between the three of us, we'd managed to turn the musty old house into our own playground. We spent hours exploring, finding dusty closets, forgotten attics, and hidden crawl spaces, all perfect for our favorite game of hide and seek. Tonight was no different. Max had proposed a final round of hide and seek before we all crashed, and we'd quickly agreed. Tommy, always competitive, had darted off without hesitation, leaving me and Max to fend for ourselves. I chose an upstairs closet with barely enough room for me to fit. Pressing my back against the wall, I waited, eyes adjusting to the dark. From where I was, I could see through a narrow gap in the door. The hallway stretched out, dimly lit by the soft glow of the moon coming in through a dusty window at the far end. I could hear faint creaks as someone walked around downstairs, probably Max, given his heavy steps. As I waited, a strange feeling began to settle over me. The silence in the house wasn't new, but there was something different about it tonight. It felt thick, like the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but instead full of something I couldn't quite place. I found myself holding my breath, listening harder, almost expecting to hear something beyond the usual creaks and groans of the house. But nothing came, just the deep, oppressive quiet. Then there it was, a shadow moving at the end of the hallway. I squinted, trying to make it out. It looked like Tommy, standing there, facing away from me. His figure was still, hands by his sides, almost like he was waiting for something. I smiled, thinking he was about to jump out and scare me. He was always trying to pull pranks on me and Max, convinced he could actually scare us one day. But as I kept watching, something felt wrong. Tommy didn't move. He just stood there, facing the wall, his back to me. It was strange, seeing him so quiet and motionless. My little brother wasn't one for patience, especially during a game. Usually he'd be giggling, unable to keep still for even a second. This stillness was unnatural. "Tommy?" I whispered, not wanting to be too loud in case he was just messing with me. He didn't respond, didn't even twitch. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I told myself he was just being stubborn, trying to freak me out by ignoring me. I leaned forward, peering through the gap a little more, and that's when Max's footsteps came up behind me. I nearly jumped as Max squeezed into the closet beside me. "Did I scare you?" he whispered, grinning in the dark. "Shh!" I hissed, pulling him closer to the door. "Look, Tommy's right there." Max squinted, looking down the hallway. Where? There at the end of the hall. He's just standing there. Max's grin faded as he looked, his expression turning to one of confusion. He's not moving? I shook my head, keeping my eyes fixed on Tommy. Something about this felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Max must have felt it too, because he wasn't smiling anymore. He was just as focused as I was, watching our little brother, waiting for him to make a move. Then, just as I was about to whisper again, Tommy's shoulders began to shake, slowly, almost rhythmically, as if he was laughing silently. My stomach dropped. This wasn't like him at all. I could feel Max tensing beside me, and suddenly I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep looking. Maybe we should just call him, Max whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, but something held me back. My instincts told me to run, to get away from this strange version of my brother, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Max must have felt it too, because he didn't make a move to leave either. We just stood there, helplessly watching as Tommy continued to shake, his back still turned to us. Then, as if he sensed our fear, he stopped. The silence fell again, even thicker than before, pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat feeling like it echoed in the emptiness around us. And then slowly, Tommy began to turn. As Tommy's figure slowly pivoted, Max and I stood frozen, trapped in that narrow closet as we watched, too terrified to move or even breathe. My mind was racing, desperate to make sense of what I was seeing, but all my instincts screamed that this wasn't my brother. Every shift of his form felt deliberate, calculated, as if he knew we were watching and wanted us to see. The moonlight from the window cast a dim glow over his face as he turned to face us completely, and that's when I felt my heart lurch. His eyes, they were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow up the light, like bottomless pits. His face wore an expression that wasn't human, a twisted, malevolent grin that stretched too wide, showing teeth that were jagged, almost animal-like. It was as if something was wearing Tommy's face, mimicking him, but without any understanding of what it meant to look human. Max gasped beside me, the sound barely a whisper. I could feel his hand grip my arm, his fingers digging in with a force that matched my own terror. We were both paralyzed, our bodies refusing to respond as that thing stared at us, its grin widening even further, stretching impossibly as if it were relishing our fear. Then, it took a step forward. The floor creaked under its weight, a slow, deliberate sound that filled the silence around us. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, but my legs felt like they were locked in place. The creature took another step, inching closer, its gaze never leaving us. The twisted smile on its face seemed to grow more sinister with each step, as if it knew we were trapped and powerless. Somehow Max found his voice before I did. His whisper was shaky, barely audible, but it broke through the suffocating fear that held us. "Nate, that's not Tommy," he murmured, his voice laced with sheer horror. I knew he was right. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't my little brother. It was something else, something wrong. I had no idea what it could be, but every fiber of my being told me it was dangerous, that we needed to get away. But the creature was only a few feet from us now, blocking the hallway, and the only escape we had was back down the narrow stairs or deeper into the house. "Nate," Max whispered again, his grip on my arm tightening. "We have to move." The creature took another step, its twisted grin never faltering, and for the first time, I saw its eyes blink. A slow, deliberate blink that somehow made it seem even more unnatural. The sheer wrongness of it sent a chill through me, breaking the spell of paralysis that had held me. I reached back, fumbling for the door handle, and yanked Max with me as we stumbled out of the closet. We darted back down the stairs, not daring to look behind us, but I could hear its footsteps following, slow and measured, as if it was in no hurry, as if it knew we had nowhere to go. The old wooden steps groaned under our weight as we stumbled into the dark living room, our breaths ragged and panicked. "Where's Tommy?" Max hissed, his eyes wide with terror. If that's not him, then where is he?" I didn't know. I hadn't seen him since the start of the game, and now I was terrified of what I might find if we went looking for him. The thought that my real brother might be somewhere in this dark, eerie house, alone and vulnerable, sent a fresh wave of dread through me. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind us, calm and unhurried. The creature was still following, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't going to stop until it found us. I looked around, desperate for a place to hide, when Max grabbed my arm and pointed to the basement door. "We can hide down there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It might lose us if we stay quiet." I hesitated. The basement was dark, damp, and filled with shadows, but it was better than being caught out in the open. Nodding, I pulled open the door, and we slipped down the creaky stairs, closing it as quietly as we could behind us. The basement was cold, with an earthy smell that made my skin prickle. We crouched behind an old stack of boxes, holding our breaths, listening to the silence. The only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then we heard it. The basement door creaked open, followed by the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps descending the stairs. It was coming for us. My mind raced, and every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, but Max held me back, shaking his head. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but he managed to keep his voice steady, whispering, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, my whole body trembling. We sat in the dark, hidden behind the boxes, as the footsteps drew closer, echoing in the cold, damp air. The footsteps grew louder, each one slow and deliberate, as if whatever was coming down the stairs knew exactly where we were. Max's hand clutched my arm tightly, his breath barely controlled, and I realized I was gripping his arm just as hard. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest I feared it would give us away. I forced myself to breathe slower, to stay silent, but every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to run out of this basement and never look back. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs, and I could feel its presence even without looking. It was close, close enough that I could hear it breathing, a shallow, rasping sound, like each breath took effort. I dared to glance around the edge of the box we were hiding behind, and that's when I saw it in the dim light that leaked down from the house above. It was standing there, just a few feet away, staring straight ahead as if it was listening for something. In the darkness, its outline was twisted, hunched, almost as if it had begun to mimic a human form, but hadn't quite gotten it right. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, scanning the basement in slow, calculated movements. That twisted, too-wide grin was still there, stretched across its face in a way that made my stomach churn. Max trembled beside me, and I could feel his fear radiating, echoing my own. The creature took a step forward, then another, its movements unnervingly fluid, like it was gliding across the floor. Every muscle in my body was tense, and I knew that if it came any closer, we'd have no choice but to run. But there was nowhere to go. Just then, there was a sound from upstairs, a soft thud like someone moving around. The creature's head snapped up at the noise, and it paused, listening intently. I held my breath, praying it would leave us alone, that it would be drawn away by the sound above. And then, in a moment that felt like a miracle, it turned and glided back up the stairs, its footsteps receding into the house. We didn't move for several minutes, both of us frozen in place, waiting, listening. Finally, Max released his grip on my arm, and I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Do you think it's gone?" Max whispered, his voice barely a breath. I didn't know. Every part of me wanted to believe it was over, that we were safe, but something told me this wasn't the end. There was still one question that gnawed at me, even through the haze of fear. Where was Tommy? The thought that he might still be out there, hiding or worse, alone with that thing, was unbearable. "We have to find Tommy," I whispered back, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. Max looked at me, his eyes wide, and after a moment, he nodded, understanding. We crept up the basement stairs, moving as silently as we could. Every creak, every tiny sound felt amplified in the stillness, but we pressed on. Once back in the hallway, I motioned for Max to follow me as we moved toward the bedrooms. My heart was racing, and every shadow seemed to pulse with hidden dangers, but I forced myself to focus. I had to find my brother. As we approached Tommy's room, I noticed the door was ajar. I pushed it open, my hand shaking, and there, lying on the bed, was Tommy. He was curled up, fast asleep, completely oblivious to the nightmare we had just endured. Relief flooded through me, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Tommy," I whispered, moving closer. I placed a hand on his shoulder, shaking him gently. His eyes fluttered open, blinking at me in confusion. "Nate," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. What's going on? I pulled him into a hug, unable to hold back the flood of relief. Max joined us, his face pale but grateful. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal again, like the nightmare had never happened. But then, we heard it, the creak of footsteps echoing from the hallway. We all froze, listening as the slow, steady steps drew closer. I looked at Tommy, my heart pounding once again. We have to go, I whispered, pulling him to his feet. Max grabbed his hand, and together we moved toward the back door, as quietly as we could manage. The footsteps followed, relentless, growing louder, like the creature knew we were trying to escape. We slipped outside into the cool night air, and I felt a rush of adrenaline as we sprinted across the yard. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, like a shadow lingering just at the edge of my vision. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the property, where the trees began to thicken into the forest beyond. Only then did I turn around, searching the darkness, but there was nothing. The house stood silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. The three of us huddled together, catching our breaths, trying to process what we'd seen. Tommy looked up at me, his eyes wide and scared. Nate, what was that? I didn't know how to answer him. All I knew was that we'd seen something that defied explanation, something that didn't belong in this world. We spent the rest of the night out there, too afraid to go back inside. Eventually, dawn broke, and the first rays of sunlight washed over the house, making it seem ordinary again, like any other home. But I knew better. That night, something had crossed over into our world, something that wore my brother's face, but was nothing like him. And even now, whenever I'm alone, I sometimes hear those footsteps in the dark, steady and relentless, as if it's still searching for us, waiting for us to come back. It started as an ordinary night out. I hadn't planned on going to the art gallery. Honestly, my friend Mike had to drag me along. But the moment we walked in, I found myself mesmerized by the paintings that lined the walls, each canvas a different story, a glimpse into someone's mind. That's where I first saw her. Jane. She was standing alone, absorbed in a dark, abstract piece hanging near the back of the gallery. Her long, dark hair framed her face as she stared at the canvas, her expression unreadable, as if she were deciphering something only she could see. I'm not sure why, but something drew me to her. Maybe it was the mystery in her gaze or the intensity with which she observed the art. Without thinking, I moved closer, curious. When she noticed me, she smiled, a slight, knowing curve of her lips that made me feel like I'd been expected. We started talking, and it was easy at first, casual, light. She told me she was an artist and had a small studio nearby. Her voice was soft but captivating, pulling me in with every word. It was refreshing, meeting someone so immersed in her craft, so different from the people I usually met in New York. Throughout the night, we talked about everything from art to our favorite places in the city. She asked questions, deep ones that felt almost too personal, but she had this way about her, making it feel natural, as if she were uncovering secrets I didn't even know I had. I remember thinking she was insightful, maybe even a little intense, but in a charming way. When the night ended, she slipped me her number, her fingers lingering just a bit too long on my hand as she said goodbye. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd enjoyed her company, sure, but New York was a big place. People came and went, especially in the circles I ran in. I didn't expect to see her again, just not unless I made the effort. Still, her face lingered in my mind that night. I fell asleep thinking about her, wondering if I'd run into her again, maybe at another gallery or around the city. The next day, though, things began to feel different. I found a note on my door when I got home, a small piece of paper tucked into the crack. It was from Jane. Somehow she'd found my address. It was nice meeting you last night, it read in neat, elegant handwriting. I hope to see you soon. I stared at the note, a strange feeling twisting in my gut. I hadn't told her where I lived, and as far as I knew, she hadn't asked any of my friends either. A bit unsettled, I brushed it off as a coincidence. Maybe she'd found me on social media, or maybe she'd asked around looking for mutual acquaintances. New York was a big city, but it was a small world. I convinced myself it was harmless, just a friendly gesture. But that feeling, that slight edge of unease, lingered. I couldn't shake it off. Over the next few days, I kept running into her. I'd see her on the subway during my commute or at a cafe I frequented near my office. Each time, she'd smile and wave as if it were all perfectly normal, as if it were fate drawing us together again and again. I wanted to believe it was chance, but each encounter felt a little too convenient, a little too well-timed. I started to feel like she was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to appear. One afternoon, I was walking through Central Park, trying to clear my head after a long day. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing, and for a brief moment, I managed to forget about her, to push away the lingering discomfort. But as I passed by a row of benches, there she was, sitting alone, sketchbook open on her lap. She looked up, her eyes lighting up as if she'd been waiting for me all along. "Daniel," she said, her voice warm, almost too familiar. "I had a feeling I'd see you here." I forced a smile, my heart sinking. It didn't feel like fate anymore. It felt calculated, like she'd known I'd be here. She patted the empty spot beside her, and reluctantly, I sat down. Her eyes seemed to study me, taking in every detail as if she were committing my face to memory. She showed me her sketchbook, page after page filled with detailed, haunting images. Her style was dark, intense, with shadows that seemed to swallow the light. And on the last page, I saw a sketch of myself. Not just any sketch, but one that captured a haunted look in my eyes, a vulnerability I wasn't even aware of. She smiled when she saw my reaction, her hand brushing against mine. "I feel like I know you," she whispered, her gaze piercing. "There's something compelling about you, something I can't quite put into words." My stomach twisted. The sketch, the note on my door, the way she seemed to know exactly where I'd be. It all felt too much, too intense. I knew then that I had to put some distance between us, to break off whatever this was before it spiraled any further. But something in her eyes told me it wouldn't be that easy. That night, I decided to stop answering her messages, hoping she'd take the hint. I wanted to believe she'd move on, that she'd understand. But deep down, I felt the weight of her presence, like an invisible thread connecting us, growing tighter with each passing day. Ignoring Jane's messages was harder than I expected. She was relentless. Every day, another text would appear on my phone, each one slightly more desperate than the last. At first, it was just casual, "I'd love to see you again," or "I hope everything's all right." But as I left her messages unanswered, the tone shifted. Her words grew more pleading, almost urgent, like I was slipping away and she couldn't bear it. Then the messages started appearing on paper, notes tucked under my apartment door or slipped into the crack of my car window. Each note was handwritten, always in the same elegant script that I'd seen in her first message. The words seemed to be carefully chosen, as if she'd thought deeply about each letter before placing it on the page. "Why are you avoiding me?" one read. "I can't stop thinking about you," said another. And then the one that truly chilled me. "You're the only one who understands me, Daniel. Please don't leave me alone." I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that she'd get tired eventually. I even told my friend Mike about it, thinking he might laugh and help me see the humor in it. But Mike's face turned serious when I mentioned the notes and her obsessive need to reach me. "You should be careful," he said. "People like that, they don't just let go easily." The unease I'd felt started to deepen. Everywhere I went, I felt her presence, as if she were just out of sight, watching me. I'd look over my shoulder in crowded streets, expecting to see her face, or glance around in cafes, half expecting her to be sitting nearby. It was like she had slipped into my life, embedding herself in the edges of my world, never too close but never far enough to ignore. One evening, as I was leaving my apartment building, I saw her standing across the street. She didn't try to hide. She just watched me, her eyes fixed on mine, her expression calm, almost serene. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't confront her. I didn't have the nerve. Instead, I turned around and walked back into the building, heart pounding, trying to ignore the fear crawling up my skin. But Jane was clever. If I tried to avoid one place, she'd simply find me somewhere else. She was everywhere, like a shadow, like she was always waiting for the moment I'd let my guard down. And then, one night, I came home to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single photograph of me, taken from behind as I walked down a street near my office. Scrawled on the back were the words, "I'll always be with you." My hands trembled as I looked at the photograph. I could no longer pretend this was just a harmless crush or some misguided sense of affection. Jane was watching me, following me, documenting my every move. I felt trapped, like I couldn't go anywhere without her knowing. I tried to tell myself it was just a scare tactic, that she wanted me to feel paranoid, but the sinking feeling in my gut told me it was more than that. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment, double-checking each one, paranoid that she might somehow slip inside. I tried to sleep, but every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift and take her shape. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. But the next morning brought no relief. As I opened my door to leave for work, I nearly tripped over a package on my welcome mat. I stared at it for a moment, dread bubbling up inside me, but eventually I picked it up, feeling its weight. I brought it back inside, too wary to open it in the hallway. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small painting. I unfolded it slowly, my breath catching as I saw what it was. It was a portrait of me. But this wasn't an ordinary likeness. The image was dark, shadowed, as if I were being swallowed by some unseen darkness. My expression was distorted, twisted with fear, my eyes wide, hollow, almost pleading. The details were disturbingly accurate, as if she had studied my face for hours, capturing every nuance of my expression. A note was attached to the frame. "I see you, Daniel. I see who you truly are." A chill ran through me. How had she made this? When had she seen me look like this? I tried to remember if I'd ever been in a situation where I looked so haunted, so exposed. But it was like she had painted something deeper, an image that reached into my mind and pulled out my darkest fears. I couldn't look at it anymore. I stuffed it back in the box, but the image was seared into my mind, haunting me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I tried to block her number, hoping it would stop the texts. I changed my daily routines, started leaving my apartment at different times, taking different routes to work. I avoided the places I knew she might show up, places we'd talked about that first night at the gallery. But no matter how hard I tried to shake her, she was always there, finding new ways to slip into my life. One night, I woke up to a faint tapping at my window. I sat up, heart racing, staring into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the tapping continued. Soft, steady, like she was waiting for me to come closer. My whole body went cold. I sat frozen in my bed, barely daring to breathe, praying it was just my imagination. Finally, the tapping stopped, and I was left in silence. But I knew she was there, somewhere in the night, watching, waiting. I knew I couldn't live like this. Jane had woven herself into every part of my life, her presence lingering even in moments I tried to find solace. I had to confront her, to end whatever twisted hold she had over me. But I had no idea where to find her. I'd stopped seeing her at the usual places, and though I felt watched constantly, she'd kept out of sight. I decided my only choice was to go to her studio, the one she'd mentioned that first night we'd met. After hours of hesitation, I gathered the courage to go. Her studio was tucked away in an old, narrow building on the Lower East Side, barely marked and easy to miss. I climbed the creaky stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. My heart hammered in my chest, and I forced myself to breathe. This had to end tonight. I opened the door and stepped into the dimly lit room. The smell of paint and turpentine hit me immediately, mingling with an underlying musty scent. The walls were lined with canvases, some covered in sheets, others leaning bare against the wall, showing only hints of the unsettling images underneath. And then, in the middle of the room, stood Jane. She turned slowly, her face lighting up when she saw me, a wide, unnatural smile spreading across her face. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft, almost soothing. "I knew you'd come." I felt a chill crawl down my spine, but I held my ground. "Jane, this has to stop," I managed to say, my voice shaking more than I wanted. "You can't keep following me, sending me things. This obsession, it's not normal." Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened, her eyes sparkling with a strange, almost feverish light. "Obsession?" she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "No, Daniel, this isn't an obsession. It's connection. I see you, the real you. No one else understands you like I do." She gestured to the canvases around the room, and I followed her gaze, dread tightening in my stomach. The walls were filled with portraits, all of me. Each painting captured a different expression, a different version of myself. fear, confusion, anger, sadness. There was one of me sitting alone at a cafe, another of me looking out a window, another of me walking down the street, glancing over my shoulder with a haunted expression. And then, in the center of it all, was the painting she'd sent me, the one with my face twisted in terror, surrounded by shadows. I felt my knees weaken. How did you do this? When did you? I know you, Daniel, she interrupted, taking a step closer. I know every part of you, even the pieces you keep hidden. I paint what I see, and I see so much that you don't even know about yourself. My heart pounded as she approached, her gaze never leaving mine. I wanted to move, to run, but her presence held me in place, like a weight pressing down on me. Jane, please, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This has to end. I can't, you need to leave me alone. She stopped, her expression shifting, softening almost. For a moment, I thought she understood that maybe I'd reached her. But then her face twisted, her smile turning cold, bitter. You can't just walk away, Daniel. You're a part of me now. Do you think I'd let you go that easily? Her voice was low, dangerous, the calmness slipping away to reveal something darker. I backed away, my pulse racing. She reached for something behind her, a large covered canvas that had been hidden from view. She yanked the sheet off, revealing a new painting, and my stomach lurched at the sight. It was me, lying in my own bed, asleep, oblivious. But there was something else in the painting, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed, watching over me. I realized with horror that she'd painted herself in the room with me, standing over me as I slept. The room began to spin. I felt trapped, suffocated. I needed to get out of there. You were in my apartment? I managed to choke out, my voice barely steady. She just smiled, that cold, knowing smile that now haunted my dreams. I'm always with you, Daniel, she whispered, even when you think you're alone. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stack of canvases. I had to get away from her, from this nightmare. Without another word, I turned and bolted from the room, my footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. I could hear her calling after me, her voice soft, almost tender, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally burst out onto the street, the cold night air hit me like a shock. I ran, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that studio. The lights of the city blurred around me, and I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment. I locked the door, bolted the windows, my heart pounding as I slumped against the wall. Over the next few days, I packed my things, made arrangements, and left New York behind. I told no one where I was going. I changed my number, deleted my social media, and tried to erase any trace of myself that Jane could follow. I found a small town hours away, quiet and isolated, and moved into a new apartment, hoping I could start over, that maybe this nightmare would finally end. But even now, in the silence of my new life, I can't shake the feeling that she's still with me. Some nights, I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear soft footsteps outside my door or the faint sound of her voice whispering my name. And sometimes in the shadows of my new home, I think I see her watching, waiting. I don't know if she'll ever truly let me go. The forest was exactly how I remembered it from my childhood, vast, peaceful, and filled with the smell of pine. The cabin was tucked away in a clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to reach endlessly into the sky. I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs, hoping the weekend here would be a perfect escape from the constant noise and chaos of Portland. This place was familiar. It felt like a sanctuary. I'd spent countless summers hiking these trails with my family, and now as I looked around, I felt that old sense of calm wash over me. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves, birds calling to each other, and the faint hum of distant insects. Alone in the forest, I felt like I could finally breathe without anyone watching or judging. I grabbed my backpack, filled with a few essentials for a short hike, and headed out from the cabin, walking toward the trail that wound its way deeper into the trees. I loved how everything felt untouched, timeless. The sunlight trickled down through the canopy, casting dappled patches of light across the forest floor, giving the whole place a dreamy glow. I walked slowly, taking in every detail, the vibrant green moss covering fallen logs, the delicate mushrooms peeking up from the soil, and the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. It was exactly the peace I'd been craving. But as I ventured further, something began to shift. The stillness, which had felt comforting only moments before, started to feel uh, thick, almost stifling. I noticed the birds had stopped chirping, and an unusual silence blanketed the forest. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just because I'd gone off the main trail, finding myself in an area that hadn't been as well trodden. The quiet was probably natural. Still, an uneasy feeling nagged at me. I couldn't shake the sense that something was different, that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the endless trees. I chuckled softly to myself, shaking my head. Spending too much time in the city must have left me paranoid. I kept walking, trying to ignore the small pangs of anxiety creeping up my spine. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to ignore the feeling. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, the faintest rustle of leaves, almost like footsteps. It was so quiet, so subtle, that I convinced myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe a deer or a fox moving through the underbrush, startled by my presence. Yet, as I continued down the trail, the sounds seemed to grow closer. I forced myself to keep moving, trying to enjoy the beauty around me, but my pace quickened. My heartbeat grew louder in my chest, and my breaths came a little faster. Just a quiet walk in the forest, I reminded myself, nothing more. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees behind me, just on the edge of my vision. I froze, heart pounding, straining to see. But when I turned fully to look, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows, silent as ever. I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, even to me. "It's nothing, Emily," I muttered under my breath, trying to steady myself. Just nerves. But even as I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't deny that something felt wrong. I'd hiked these woods enough to know the difference between natural forest sounds and whatever this was. I tried to brush it off again, telling myself that I was just on edge. Maybe I wasn't used to the silence anymore after living in the city for so long. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. But as I continued to walk, that shadow appeared again, a fleeting glimpse in the corner of my eye. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what I might find. The feeling of being watched pressed down on me, heavy and unshakable. I could feel my pulse quickening, and suddenly, the forest didn't feel as welcoming as it had before. I tried to quicken my pace, convincing myself that if I just reached the clearing up ahead, everything would feel normal again. But as I sped up, so did the shadow. It matched my every step, always staying just far enough behind that I couldn't quite make it out. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced around, searching for somewhere to hide or a way to lose whatever was following me. My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Maybe it was another hiker, I thought, or perhaps a forest ranger. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This presence was different. It felt deliberate, intentional, as if it wanted to remain hidden, but wanted me to know it was there. I forced myself to keep walking, resisting the urge to look over my shoulder. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to find somewhere safe, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself, didn't want to believe I was actually being followed. Still, my footsteps quickened, and I felt my breaths becoming shallow, almost gasping. The trail was familiar, winding through the trees in a gentle loop that would eventually lead me back to the cabin. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, focusing on the path, telling myself it was only a few more minutes until I'd be safely inside. But as I walked, the silence around me grew thicker, heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then, I heard it, a soft rustle in the leaves behind me, followed by the faint crunch of twigs snapping. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding, every sense heightened. I waited, barely breathing, hoping it was just an animal or the wind. But then I heard it again, louder this time, like deliberate footsteps. My throat went dry. This wasn't an animal, it was a person. Someone was walking behind me slowly, as if they were trying to stay hidden but not completely silent. A wave of cold fear washed over me, freezing me in place. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see who or what was there. But I couldn't just stand there, waiting to be caught. I took a shaky breath, then started walking again, faster this time, almost at a jog. The footsteps quickened too, matching my pace, and I knew without a doubt that I was being followed. Panic set in, and I broke into a run, no longer caring about staying calm or quiet. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whoever was behind me. Branches whipped at my face as I veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay on the path. The footsteps behind me grew fainter, but I didn't stop. I couldn't risk it. I pushed through the thick brush, ducking under low-hanging branches, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a dense cluster of trees up ahead, their roots forming a natural hollow in the ground. Without thinking, I threw myself into the hollow, pressing my body against the ground, trying to make myself as small as possible. My breaths came shallow and fast, and I struggled to control them, afraid that even the sound of my breathing might give me away. I lay there, hidden among the roots and leaves, listening, waiting. My pulse hammered in my ears, making it hard to hear anything else, but slowly, gradually, I began to make out the sounds around me. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence was complete, absolute. I didn't know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. Then, I heard it, a faint rustling, like someone brushing against the leaves just a few feet away. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, praying that whoever it was wouldn't notice me. I closed my eyes, as if that might somehow make me disappear, make me invisible. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly, each second feeling like an eternity. I could hear the person moving nearby, slow and deliberate, as if they were searching for something. For me. My mind raced, wondering what kind of person would follow someone into the forest, what they wanted, why they wouldn't just go away. Finally, the footsteps began to fade, moving further away. I stayed perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid that any noise might bring them back. I counted to 100, then another 100, waiting until I was absolutely certain they were gone. Only then did I slowly sit up, my whole body trembling. I peeked over the edge of my hiding place, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest was still, the shadows deep and undisturbed. I didn't see anyone, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me, warning me it wasn't safe yet. Cautiously, I climbed out of the hollow, staying low, moving as quietly as possible. My legs felt weak, shaky, but I forced myself to stay focused. I had to get back to the cabin, had to find a way out of these woods before they came back. I made my way through the trees, avoiding the main trail, moving as quickly and silently as I could. Every now and then I'd stop, listening for any sign of footsteps or movement. But the forest remained silent, almost oppressively so, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting. After what felt like hours, I finally caught sight of the clearing where the cabin stood. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't dare let my guard down yet. I broke into a sprint, crossing the clearing in a few long strides, reaching the door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but finally I managed to unlock it and slip inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. The cabin was dark and silent, shadows pressing in from all sides. I quickly locked the door, then moved to the windows, drawing the curtains and checking the locks, making sure everything was secure. Only after checking every corner, every possible entrance, did I allow myself to sit down, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I'd come here for peace, for solitude, but now I felt like a prisoner in this cabin, trapped by my own fear. Somewhere out there in the woods, someone had followed me, hunted me, and even though I was safe inside now, I knew I'd never feel truly safe again. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. I sat there, my back pressed against the wall, my knees drawn to my chest, barely daring to breathe. My mind raced, replaying every moment in the forest, the footsteps, the shadow, the feeling of being watched. I'd thought I could escape, thought that closing the door behind me would be enough. But the fear hadn't left, it lingered, settling over me like a thick fog, making it impossible to feel safe. I checked my phone, hoping for some distraction, a connection to the outside world, but there was no signal. The cabin was too remote, too deep in the forest. The isolation that had felt so comforting just a day ago now seemed like a trap. No one knew I was here. No one would hear me if I screamed. I got up, checking the locks on the windows again, then moved to the small closet to grab a flashlight. The power in the cabin was notoriously unreliable, and with night quickly falling, I knew I'd need some kind of backup light if anything went wrong. As I clicked the flashlight on, the beam illuminated the dim corners of the cabin, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I shivered, reminding myself to stay calm. But then, just as I was beginning to feel a hint of control, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound outside, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I froze, my grip on the flashlight tightening. The sound came again, closer this time, slow and deliberate, as if someone were dragging their hand along the wall. My heart pounded, and I fought the urge to run. I forced myself to stay still, listening, hoping it was just an animal. But then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft and measured, circling around the cabin. Whoever had followed me through the forest was here. I backed away, my eyes locked on the windows, watching for any sign of movement outside. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Should I turn off the lights, hide, pretend the cabin was empty? Or should I try to make a run for it, to escape before they found a way inside? The footsteps stopped just outside the front door, and I held my breath, straining to hear. There was a long pause, an unbearable silence, and then a slow, deliberate knock. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and hollow. Whoever was outside wanted me to know they were there. I took a shaky step back, my pulse racing, my body paralyzed with fear. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was as if they knew I was inside, knew I was alone, and wanted me to open the door, to let them in. Desperation clawed at me, and I glanced toward the back of the cabin, where a small window overlooked the forest. I knew it would be dangerous to go back out there, but staying here felt worse, like waiting for the inevitable. I had to get out, had to put as much distance between myself and whoever was at the door. Slowly, I crept toward the back window, praying the floor wouldn't creak. My hands shook as I lifted the window, pushing it open as quietly as I could. The cold night air rushed in, bringing with it the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I glanced over my shoulder at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. With one last deep breath, I climbed out, dropping to the ground outside. I stayed low, crouching in the shadows, and listened. The footsteps were still near the front of the cabin, but I didn't dare linger. I turned and ran, moving as quietly as I could, slipping into the cover of the trees. The forest was dark, the moon barely breaking through the thick canopy, but I didn't stop. I moved deeper into the woods, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the cabin. My heart pounded, and every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, but I pushed forward, fueled by fear. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a small clearing and sank to the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was alone, but the memory of the footsteps, the knocking, clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had followed me through the forest, whoever had knocked on that door, was still out there, watching, waiting. I stayed in that clearing until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Only then did I muster the courage to stand, to make my way back toward the cabin. Every step felt like a test, each one bringing me closer to that place of fear. When I finally reached the cabin, I found it empty and untouched, as if nothing had happened. The door was locked, the windows secure, and there was no sign of anyone outside. But I knew better. I could still feel the fear deep in my bones, and I knew I'd never be able to forget the sound of those footsteps, the way they'd followed me through the forest, relentless and unyielding. I packed my things in silence, my hands trembling, and left the cabin, vowing never to return. The forest, once a place of peace, had become something else. A place where shadows lurked, where silence held secrets I was too afraid to uncover. As I drove away, I couldn't help but look back, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me leave.